Section 40 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by Francois Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 33. Charles IX. And the Religious Wars, 1560 to 1574, Part 6. The negotiations were short. The war had been going on for 2 years. The two parties, victorious and vanquished by turns, were both equally sick of it. In vain did Philip II., King of Spain, offer Charles IX. An aid of 9,000 men to continue it. In vain did Pope Pius V. write to Catherine de' Medici, "As there can be no communication between Satan and the children of the light, it ought to be taken for certain that there can be no compact between Catholics and heretics, save one full of fraud and feint." "We have beaten our enemies," says Montluc, "over and over again, but, notwithstanding that, they had so much influence in the king's council that the decrees were always to their advantage. We won by arms, but they won by those devils of documents." Peace was concluded at Saint Germain en Laye on the 8th of August, 1570, and it was more equitable and better for the Reformers than the preceding treaties. For, besides a pretty large extension as regarded free exercise of their worship and their civil rights in the state, it granted "for 2 years to the princes of Navarre and Conde and 20 noblemen of the religion, who were appointed by the king, the wardenship of the towns of La Rochelle, Cognac, Montauban, and La Charite, whither those of the religion who dared not return so soon to their own homes might retire." All the members of the Parliament, all the royal and municipal officers, and the principal inhabitants of the town where the two religions existed were further bound over on oath "to maintenance of the edict." Peace was made, but it was the third in 7 years, and very shortly after each new treaty civil war had recommenced. No more was expected from the treaty of Saint Germain en Laye than had been effected by those of Amboise and Longjumeau, and on both sides men sighed for something more stable and definitive. By what means to be obtained, and with what pledges of durability? A singular fact is apparent between 1570 and 1572: there is a season, as it were, of marriages and matrimonial rejoicings. Charles IX. went to receive at the frontier of his kingdom his affianced bride, Archduchess Elizabeth of Austria, daughter of the Emperor Maximilian II., who was escorted by the Archbishop of Treves, chancellor of the empire. The nuptials were celebrated at Mezières on the 26th of November, 1570. The princes and great lords of the Protestant party were invited. They did not think it advisable to withdraw themselves from their asylum at La Rochelle; but Coligny wrote to the queen mother to excuse himself, whilst protesting his forgetfulness of the past and his personal devotion. 4 months afterwards, Coligny himself married again. It was 3 years since he had lost his noble wife, Charlotte de Laval, and he had not contemplated anything of the kind, when, in the concluding weeks of 1570, he received from the castle of Saint Andre de Briord, in Le Bugey, a letter from a great lady, 30 years of age, Jacqueline de Montbel, daughter of Count d'Entremont, herself a widow, who wrote to him "that she would fain marry a saint and a hero, and that he was that hero." "I am but a tomb," replied Coligny. But Jacqueline persisted, in spite of the opposition shown by her sovereign, Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, who did not like his fair subjects to marry foreigners; and in February, 1571, she furtively quitted her castle, dropped down the Rhone in a boat as far as Lyons, mounted on horseback, and, escorted by 5 devoted friends, arrived at La Rochelle. All Coligny's friends were urgent for him to accept this passionate devotion proffered by a lady who would bring him territorial possessions valuable to the Protestants, "for they were an open door to Geneva." Coligny accepted, and the marriage took place at La Rochelle on the 24th of March, 1571. "Madame Jacqueline wore on this occasion," says a contemporary chronicler, "a skirt in the Spanish fashion, of black gold tissue, with bands of embroidery in gold and silver twist, and above a doublet of white silver tissue embroidered in gold, with large diamond buttons." She was nevertheless at that moment almost as poor as the German arquebusier who escorted her litter, for an edict issued by the Duke of Savoy on the 31st of January, 1569, caused her the loss of all her possessions in her own country. She was received in France with the respect due to her; and when, 5 months after the marriage, Charles IX. Summoned Coligny to Paris, "to serve him in his most important affairs as a worthy minister, whose virtues were sufficiently known and tried," he sent at the same time to Madame l'Amirale a safe conduct in which he called her my fair cousin. Was there any one belonging to that august and illustrious household who had at that time a presentiment of their impending and tragic destiny? At the same period, the Queen of Navarre, Jeanne d'Albret, obtained for her young nephew, Henry de Bourbon, Prince of Conde, son of the hero of Jarnac, and companion of Henry of Navarre, the hand of his cousin, Mary of Cleves, and there was still going on in London, on behalf of one of Charles IX.'s brothers, at one time the Duke of Anjou and at another the Duke of Alencon, the negotiation which was a vain attempt to make Queen Elizabeth espouse a French prince. Coincidentally with all these marriages or projects of marriage amongst princes and great lords, came the most important of all, that which was to unite Henry of Navarre and Charles IX.'s sister, Marguerite de Valois. There had already, 13 or 14 years previously, been some talk about it, in the reign of King Henry II., when Henry of Navarre and Margaret de Valois, each born in 1553, were both of them mere babies. This union between the two branches of the royal house, one Catholic and the other Protestant, ought to have been the most striking sign and the surest pledge of peace between Catholicism and Protestantism. The political expediency of such a step appeared the more evident and the more urgent in proportion as the religious war had become more direful and the desire for peace more general. Charles IX. Embraced the idea passionately. At the outset he encountered an obstacle. The young Duke of Guise had already paid court to Marguerite, and had obtained such marked favor with her that the ambassador of Spain wrote to the king, "There is no public topic in France just now save the marriage of my lady Marguerite with the Duke of Guise." People even talked of a tender correspondence between the princess and the duke, which was carried on through one of the queen's ladies, the Countess of Mirandola, who was devoted to the Guises and a favorite with Marguerite. "If it be so," said Charles IX. savagely, "we will kill him." And he gave such peremptory orders on this subject that Henry de Guise, somewhat disquieted, avoided for a while taking part in the royal hunts, and thought it well that there should be resumed on his behalf a project of marriage with Catherine of Cleves, widow of the Prince of Porcien, or Le Porcien, and the wealthy heiress to some great domains, especially the countship of Eu. So long as he had some hope of marrying Marguerite de Valois, the Duke of Guise had repudiated, not without offensiveness, all idea of union with Catherine of Cleves. "Anybody who can make me marry the Princess of Porcien," said he, "could make me marry a negress." He nevertheless contracted this marriage, so greatly disdained, on the 4th of October, 1570, and at this price recovered the good graces of Charles IX. The queen mother charged the Cardinal Louis de Lorraine, him who the people called Cardinal Bottles, from his conviviality, to publicly give the lie to any rumor of a possible engagement between her daughter Marguerite and Henry de Guise, and a grand council of the kings, after 3 holdings, adopted in principle the marriage of Marguerite de Valois with "the little Prince of Bearn." Charles IX. at once set his hand to the work to turn this resolution to good account, being the only means, he said, of putting a stop at last to this incessantly renewed civil war, which was the plague of his life as well as of his kingdom. He first of all sent Marshal de Cosse to La Rochelle to sound Soligny as to his feelings upon this subject, and to urge him to thus cut short public woes and the Reformers' grievances. "The king has always desired peace," said the marshal; "he wishes it to be lasting; he has proved only too well, to his own misery and that of his people, that of all the evils which can inflict a state the most direful is civil war. But what means this withdrawal since the signing of peace at Saint Germain, of the Queen of Navarre and her children, of the Prince of Conde, and so many lords and distinguished nobles, still separated from their houses and their families, and collected together in a town like Rochelle, which has great advantages by land and sea for all those who would fain begin the troubles again? Why have they not returned home? During the hottest part of the war they ardently desired to see once more their houses, their wives, and their children; and now, when peace leaves them free to do so, they prefer to remain in a land which is in some sort foreign, and where, in addition to great expenses, they are deprived of the conveniences they would find at home. The king cannot make out such absurdity, or rather he is very apprehensive that this long stay means the hatching of some evil design." The Protestants defended themselves warmly against this supposition. They alleged, in explanation of their persistent disquietude, the very imperfect execution of the conditions granted by the peace of Saint Germain, and the insults, the attacks which they had still to suffer in many parts of the kingdom, and quite recently at Rouen and at Orange. The king attempted, without any great success, to repress these disorders amongst the populace. The Queen of Navarre, the two princes, Coligny, and many Protestant lords remained still at La Rochelle, where was being held at this time a general synod of the Reformed churches. Charles IX. sent thither Marshal de Biron, with formal orders to negotiate the marriage of Marguerite de Valois and the Prince of Navarre, and to induce that prince, his mother the Queen of Navarre, and Coligny to repair to the court in order to conclude the matter. The young prince was at that time in Warn. The queen, his mother, answered "that she would consult her spiritual advisers, and as soon as her conscience was at rest, there were no conditions she would not accept with a view of giving satisfaction to the king and the queen, of marking her obedience and respect towards them, and of securing the tranquillity of the state, an object for which she would willingly sacrifice her own life. But," she added, "I would rather sink to the condition of the humblest damoiselle in France than sacrifice to the aggrandizement of my family my own soul and my son's." In September 1571 Charles IX. And the queen mother repaired to Blois; and at their urgent request Coligny went thither to talk over the projected marriage and the affairs of Europe. The king received him with emotional satisfaction, calling him my father, and saying to him, "Now we have you, and you shall not escape us when you wish to." Jeanne d'Albret, more distrustful, or, one ought rather to say, more clear sighted, refused to leave La Rochelle, and continued to negotiate vaguely and from a distance. Catherine de' Medici insisted. "Satisfy," she wrote to her, "the extreme desire we have to see you in this company. You will be loved and honored therein as accords with reason and with what you are." Jeanne still waited. It was only in the following year, at the end of January, that, having earnestly exhorted her son "to remain Bearnwards whilst she was at the court of France," she set out for Blois, where Charles IX. received her most affectionately, calling her my good aunt, my dear aunt, and lavishing upon her promises as well as endearments. Jeanne was a strict and a judicious person, and the manners and proceedings of the court at Blois displeased her. On the 8th of March, 1572, she wrote to her son, "I find it necessary to negotiate quite contrariwise to what I had expected and what had been promised me. I have no liberty to speak to the king or my Lady Marguerite, only to the queen mother, who treats me as if I were dirt. Seeing, then, that no advance is made, and that the desire is to make me hurry matters, and not conduct them orderly, I have thrice spoken thereof to the queen, who does nothing but make a fool of me, and tell everybody the opposite of what I told her. In such sort that my friends find fault with me, and I know not how to bring her to book; for when I say to her, 'Madame, it is reported that I said so and so to you,' though it was she herself who reported it, she denies it flatly, and laughs in my face, and uses me in such wise that you might really say that my patience passes that of Griselda. Thenceforward I have a troop of Huguenots who come to converse with me, rather for the purpose of being spies upon me than of assisting me. Then I have some of another humor, who hamper me no less, and who are religious hermaphrodites. I defend myself as best I may. I am sure that if you only knew the trouble I am in, you would have pity upon me; for they give me empty speeches and raillery instead of treating with me gravely, as the matter deserves; in such sort that I am bursting, because I am so resolved not to lose my temper that my patience is a miracle to see. I found your letter very much to my taste. I will show it to my Lady Marguerite if I can. She is beautiful and discreet, and of good demeanor, but brought up in the most accursed and most corrupt society that ever was. I would not, for anything in the world, have you here to remain here. That is why I desire to get you married, and you and your wife withdraw from this corruption; for though I believed it to be very great, I find it still more so. Here it is not the men who solicit the women, it is the women who solicit the men. If you were here, you would never escape without a great deal of God's grace." Side by side with this motherly and Christianly scrupulous negotiation, Coligny set on foot another, noble and dignified also, but even less in harmony with the habits and bent of the government which it concerned. The Puritan warrior was at the same time an ardent patriot. He had at heart the greatness of France as much as he had his personal creed. The reverses of Francis I. and the preponderance of Spain in Europe oppressed his spirit with a sense of national decadence, from which he wanted France to lift herself up again. The moment appeared to him propitious. Let the king ally himself with Queen Elizabeth of England, the Prince of Orange in the Low Countries, and the Protestant princes of Germany. Here was for France a certain guarantee of power in Europe, and at the same time a natural opportunity for conquering Flanders, a possession so necessary to her strength and her security. But high above this policy, so thoroughly French, towered a question still more important than that of even the security and the grandeur of France. That was the partition of Europe between Catholicism and Protestantism; and it was in a country Catholic in respect of the great majority, and governed by a kingship with which Catholicism was hereditary, that, in order to put a stop to civil war between French Catholics and Protestants, Coligny pressed the king to put himself at the head of an essentially Protestant coalition, and make it triumphant in Europe. This was, in the 16th century, a policy wholly chimerical, however patriotic its intention may have been; and the French Protestant hero who recommended it to Charles IX. Did not know that Protestantism was on the eve of the greatest disaster it would have to endure in France. A fact of a personal character tended to mislead Coligny. By his renown, by the loftiness of his views, by the earnest gravity of his character and his language, he had produced a great effect upon Charles IX. A young king of warm imagination and impressible and sympathetic temperament, but at the same time of weak judgment. He readily gave way, in Coligny's company, to outpourings which had all the appearance of perfect and involuntary frankness. "Speaking one day to the admiral about the course of conduct to be adopted as to the enterprise against Flanders, and well knowing that the queen mother lay under his suspicion, 'My dear father,' said he, 'there is one thing herein of which we must take good heed, and that is, that the queen my mother, who likes to poke her nose everywhere, as you know, learn nothing of this enterprise, at any rate as regards the main spring of it, for she will spoil all for us.' 'As you please, sir, but I take her to be so good a mother, and so devoted to the welfare of your kingdom, that when she knows of it she will do nothing to spoil it.' 'You are mistaken, my dear father,' said the king; 'leave it to me only. I see quite well that you do not know my mother; she is the greatest meddler in all the world.'" Another time, when he was speaking likewise to Teligny, Coligny's son in law, about this enterprise against Flanders, the king said, "Wouldst have me speak to thee freely, Teligny? I distrust all these gentry. I am suspicious of Tavannes' ambition. Vieilleville loves nothing but good wine. Cosse is too covetous. Montmorency cares only for his hunting and hawking. The Count de Retz is a Spaniard. The other lords of my court and those of my council are mere blockheads. My secretaries of state, to hide nothing of what I think, are not faithful to me; insomuch that, to tell the truth, I know not at what end to begin." This tone of freedom and confidence had inspired Coligny with reciprocal confidence. He believed himself to have a decisive influence over the king's ideas and conduct; and when the Protestants testified their distrust upon this subject, he reproached them vehemently for it. He affirmed the king's good intentions and sincerity; and he considered himself, in fact, said Catherine de' Medici with temper, "a second king of France." How much sincerity was there about these outpourings of Charles IX. In his intercourse with Coligny, and how much reality in the admiral's influence over the king? We are touching upon that great historical question which has been so much disputed. Was the St. Bartholomew a design, long ago determined upon and prepared for, of Charles IX. and his government, or an almost sudden resolution, brought about by events and the situation of the moment, to which Charles IX. was egged on, not without difficulty, by his mother Catherine and his advisers? Section 40.